Welcome to the 14th episode in the first season of Justice Center Weekly, a video cast from the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms. I'm your host, Kevin Steele, and with us is Luke Neilson, Education Programs Coordinator with the Center. And he's here today because we're going to discuss the imminent release of the second part of his report on digital ID. Part 1 came out at the beginning of April. Maybe, Luke, we can start by taking a moment to recap that first release before we move on to Part 2, so we can see how these follow and fit. Luke?
Well, thanks so much for having me back on the show, Kevin. It's good to be back. So we released Part 1 of our paper on digital ID, surveillance, and privacy a few months ago. I believe that paper has had a positive impact on the conversation about digital ID, security, and privacy in Canada. I found out today that the paper is the third item in a Google News search on digital ID Canada. So people are listening to the report. People are finding the analysis valuable. I'm very glad about that. In Part 1, we're trying to answer the question, what is digital ID and why should Canadians care about it? So according to Juniper Research, there are 4.8 billion users of digital ID across the globe today. That's a lot of people with a digital ID on their smartphone or on their desktop computer. Digital ID programs have been adopted by more than 70 countries across the globe, and the numbers keep rising every month. Governments and private industry are very eager to systematize digital ID, both within their countries and beyond, to facilitate economic partnerships, to solve security issues, and to provide users with a more convenient experience when interacting with government services or with, entities in the private sector. Now, we pointed out that digital ID program looks like many different things, from, the smartphone applications on people's phones in France to microchipped cards in Japan to even privacy-enhancing features in the UK. But what we're ultimately showing is that the digital ID situation in Canada is far from perfect. Governments and partnering agencies like think tanks and policy bodies like the World Economic Forum are advocating for digital ID programs that are not just mere counterparts to passports and driver's license. They're not just a way of getting in places. They're also sophisticated technologies that allow governments to capture unnecessary data about Canadians. When you combine this with what I consider to be two permissive privacy laws, you're looking at a future where governments can use law and can use technologies to capture what we consider to be unnecessary information about Canadians. Information about their bodies, information about their beliefs, their personalities, their tendencies, their financial transactions, and even their workplace performance. So, if your father had trouble keeping track of your wallet, no worries, your wallet keeps track of you today. And so the Justice Center is trying to make Canadians aware through research and policy analysis that digital ID is not what the government promises. It's not just a digital counterpart to physical ID, like the familiar driver's license or passport. It's really a tracking and a profiling technology that allows the governments to know more about you than your partner knows about you, more about you than your friends know about you. So that's Part 1, and we're looking forward to Part 2.
Right. Well, I just want to take a moment to praise you because I have praised you in the past on other podcasts to other people, but to your face now, what I really liked about Part 1 was the fact that you made this distinction in digital ID. There's the kind that, supplements a passport or a driver's license, and this is used for identification. Then there's the other kind, and that's where the information collection comes in, and that's not the good part. So, we can have benefits from digital ID, but not necessarily from the data collection. I hope there's an equal revelation in Part 2, but here's hoping.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know what? Part of the purpose of Part 1 was to show Canadians that the concerning part about digital ID is not that it's digital, right? At the Justice Center, we're very pro-technology. We love when technologies impact people's lives positively, boost profitability, lower costs, allow people to access goods and services more efficiently and more conveniently. If it's not the digital aspect of it, it's the fact that so many of these digital programs come with additional functionalities, right? Smartphones don't just deliver to you the promised goods and services. They also start tracking information about you because it's immensely profitable for governments and corporations to know about you, to know what you're likely to buy tomorrow, to know what sorts of movies you've watched in the last week, to know what kind of political parties you donate to. So again, the concern is not so much with the digital aspect of digital ID. It's with the fact that digital technologies can be used for privacy violating reasons, for reasons that harm people's charter rights and freedoms. And so, yeah, part of the purpose of part one is to clarify what exactly is the problem with digital ID.
Okay. Moving on to part two, then. What have you got in store for us?
So in part one, we make the claim, look, digital ID that tracks you, that profiles you, that knows more about you than anyone else knows about you, is bad because it violates your privacy. Now, the question is, why is privacy valuable? Today, I was at the Calgary Stampede talking with Canadians and many people from abroad about whether or not they value privacy. I talked to probably 50 people today. Not a single person said that they didn't value privacy. But like most Canadians, most people have a hard time defending privacy. And so a follow-up question was, some people say that privacy is only valuable to criminals. It's only valuable to people who have something to hide from the government or from their community. And that's a really powerful counter argument to the value of privacy. So in part two, we are going to give Canadians a defense of the value of privacy. When governments say, we need to know everything about you, I want Canadians to feel equipped to say, no, you don't need to know everything about you. It's not because I have something to hide from you. It's because privacy is valuable for various reasons. So one of those reasons, Kevin, is this. Privacy is valuable because it's necessary for the enjoyment of security. Now, security we might define as maybe freedom from unnecessary harm or danger. I'm not a lawyer, so that's probably not the legal definition, but that's a fairly common sense understanding of security. It's freedom from unnecessary danger or harm. Now, we argue in the forthcoming paper that when your privacy is violated, you're exposed to an unreasonable degree of harm or danger. And this can happen in two ways, right? Suppose a government collects a ton of information about you, where you spent your money, kind of the mundane garden variety information about you, like where you live, how tall you are, what your sex is, what your age is, but also where you spend your money and where you go on a typical Tuesday night and what political parties you fund and what charities you donate to. When you're capturing that data, you're creating a database of data that can be captured by other people, nefarious external actors. We see this all the time. Data is never secure, no matter how confident governments or corporations are that your data is unhackable. It's simply not true. If data exists, it can be hacked. I'm thinking of the case from 2019 where a Desjardins employee accessed the first and last names, the dates of birth, the social insurance numbers, the street addresses, the phone numbers, the emails, and the transaction histories of more than 9.7 million Canadians. Hackers can't hack data that doesn't exist. That data existed, and it could be hacked. In 2019, Life Labs admitted to having been hacked and having lost the healthcare data of more than 15 million Canadians. Lost.
Okay.
Unbelievable. In 2020, the Canadian Revenue Agency locked more than 800,000 Canadian accounts from their users over privacy concerns, over the fear of a breach. 10,000 CRA accounts were illicitly hacked. In 2022, the Canadian Department of Global Affairs and the IT system used by members of Parliament and their staff were hacked. So the point is, if governments are capturing unnecessary data about Canadians, they're exposing Canadians to what I consider to be an unreasonable amount of risk, right? If the data exists, it can be hacked. If it's hacked, it exposes Canadians to a lot of heartache, a lot of trouble. And so there has to be a very compelling argument in my mind for capturing that kind of data because of the risks involved. Now, that's one dimension of security. right? That's one concern. If the data exists, it can be hacked by, for instance, non-government actors. But there's another concern, which is governments could use what they know about Canadians to harm them, right? Now, ideally, Kevin, we would live in a world where governments are always perfect. They're always ethical. Every member of parliament, every cabinet minister, every low-level bureaucrat values your privacy, knows the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and is a fierce advocate for the same. That's unfortunately not the government we live in, right? Low-level bureaucrats get a memo from up above. They make decisions that impact the security of Canadians, and it's above their pay grade, right? Governments make decisions that violate the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms and let the courts worry about it a few years down the road. So, for instance, this is a well-worn tale by now, but during the era of the COVID pandemic, the federal government admitted to tracking the mobility data of 33 million Canadian smartphones just to see whether Canadians were complying with non-pharmaceutical interventions or lockdowns, right? I think most Canadians would agree that a government tracking your mobility across time seems to be a violation of your privacy, and that the government has to do some work explaining why that occurred. We're, again, very familiar with the February 2022 Freedom Convoy that occurred in Ottawa. People, including clients of the Justice Centre, made donations to that movement when the movement was a perfectly legal political demonstration. It was not banned. It was not deemed illegal or criminal. People made donations to support the voice of thousands of Canadians. And those who donated, their records were hacked, their banking data was surrendered to the police, and sanctions were imposed on them. And so, for many Canadians, they were unable to pay rent or buy groceries or put gasoline in their cars because of political expression. Not because, let's say they had paid cash. A lot of people are advocates for cash. I use a smart wallet. Again, the digital isn't the problem here. It's the fact that when you use a digital wallet, governments can start tracking you. And unless the government's perfectly ethical, there's always a risk that the government will use what they know about you to impact your security negatively. Now,
based on what you said there, obviously, no government is going to be perfectly ethical at any given moment. So obviously the danger is constant, I would say.
Yeah, and to be charitable to the government for a moment. I'm an imperfect human being. I've met politicians. I can tell you they're imperfect human beings. We don't expect anything more of our politicians than that. We don't expect every politician at every moment to always make the right decisions, and that's why we build laws. We build laws or structures that help people navigate proper behavior, so that they do the right thing more often than not. Right? Now, when we see governments failing to have a respect for the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, failing to have a respect for those really significant documents and histories and traditions that prioritize rights and freedoms, we're in big trouble, right? People get locked out of their accounts. People go to prison.
Right, yeah.
So, yeah.
Can see why we would value privacy in these circumstances. Okay, why else should we value our privacy?
Well, a lot of academics and a lot of ordinary Canadians like me think that privacy is necessary for autonomy, right? So imagine, Kevin, that there was a government camera in your office and in your home at all moments of the day, right? I imagine your behaviors would start changing over time. In fact, I spoke with a gentleman today at the Calgary Stampede who has been a fervent supporter of the Justice Centre for many years. And he told me that he feels like he is being surveilled, I suppose, all the time. He feels that at every moment, the government can know about his behaviors through his smartphone, through his, smart home, like his thermostat or his Alexa. And so he said that he has started modifying his behaviors so that he's above reproach, right? The government can't possibly use what they know about him against him. And so we're saying in the paper, the forthcoming paper, that digital ID technologies with surveillance functionalities limit autonomy. And autonomy is it's your capacity as a rational, deliberative agent to choose the life that you want for yourself, right? To be yourself, to set a goal for your life and pursue that goal, right? When governments are monitoring individuals at every moment of every day, capturing things about individuals they have no business knowing, it's going to have an impact on things that are very important to us, like what kind of scientific projects we pursue, like what kind of political expression we engage in, what kind of novels we write, what kind of political blogs we write, who our friends are, what neighborhoods we live in. And so, autonomy is kind of a fuzzy value, right? When I read the news, Kevin, and when I hop on the CBC, I don't hear terms like autonomy feature very often in public discourse. But it is such a rich concept, and it is so important for our laws, um, for our understanding of individuals and what's owed to them by their governments. Um, I don't think, I don't know. I'm not willing to trade the convenience of digital ID for my autonomy, for my ability to express myself and be wrong sometimes, and choose my friends and choose where I engage in business and choose my charities and my churches and my political parties. So in the paper, we're going to argue that if you want autonomy, you have to value privacy. And so you have to be cautious about the kinds of digital ID programs that are being rolled out today.
Certainly, I'm thinking about that guy at the Stampede when he's modifying his behavior. It sounded to me almost like a religious experience, Oh, well, God is always watching and I modify my behavior. While all of a sudden you've got the government in the position of God. And, well, I can say that they don't offer the same rewards and not necessarily the same ethics. So I would
Yeah, I mean,
caution on that.
I've never heard a provincial or federal government that has offered me some promise of salvation, right? According to
Right.
many different theological perspectives, a feature of God is his omnipotence, his all knowingness. And I
Yeah.
think governments have that ambition. They have that ambition to know everything about everyone at all times for
Right.
understandable reasons. You make money when you know everything about everyone, right?
Right.
You outcompete your competitors. You're the first to launch new technologies. You're the first to engage in new sectors of the economy, right? There are all these very understandable motivations for omnipotence, for knowing everything. The purpose of this paper is to say that's not the role of government. Governments need to exercise some more humility. Governments need to stop expanding and expanding and expanding into what should be protected human domains, domains where the government should never be involved for good reason.
Right. Well, I'm thinking of the data breaches that I've known of in the past, and some of those involved health data,
Mhm.
family members, and there's influence and modification, behavior modification that comes, or attempted behavior modification that comes with that kind of knowledge that the marketers might gain, and we see this in the private sector, and I'm sure that it is one of the autonomy issues that you're concerned with as well. The influence on a person's behavior outside of just surveillance, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in my conversations with again about 50 Canadians and people from across the world at the Stampede today, it's amazing how many people told me that they only use cash. Now that's
Mm,
really bizarre. I mean, these are people who like ride the C train. These are people who like have degrees. These are people who, you know, they're not Luddites. They're not technology averse, and yet a huge segment of the population won't conduct transactions digitally because they're concerned about that data being used for profit or being used to
mm.
harm them. I think it's time that governments and policy designers start paying attention to that really important segment of the population. They're important members of our society, and there's a reason they have that fear. I think it's a very reasonable fear.
I think that some would argue that they already are paying attention to them, and that's why they're trying to get rid of cash. But that's
Yeah, that's one way of doing it, right?
yeah,
Just make it impossible for those people to exist.
right. Okay. Okay. So do we have another list under, or another reason to value our privacy in the upcoming report?
Yeah, again, this concept is rather fuzzy. It won't feature very often in political debates or in the
Mm,
news. But this is an appeal to human dignity, right?
okay.
Humans are special. Humans are worth protecting. This is why we have laws. This is why we have the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We recognize something valuable about human beings, and we're trying to define conditions that help them flourish, or at least protect them from being viciously harmed by governments and by each other, right? And so the, the notion of human dignity underlies so much of like our constitution in this country, our laws in this country. And in the forthcoming paper, we say that, look, human beings are special. They are not just specimens or objects for analysis in a laboratory. They're unique and they have free will. I'll let the philosophers and the scientists and the physicists say all day that there's no such thing as free will. I think even if we reject the notion on a scientific level or on a philosophical level, it's still valuable to believe in it on the political level. I don't want my government to think that my behavior in the future can be perfectly modeled based on the shows I watched last week and my social media activity and my mobility behaviors. I feel like I can set on a new path for my life at any moment. I can't be perfectly understood by a catalog of facts about me. My future behavior can't be perfectly predicted. And so really, again, it's fuzzy, but it's important. Human beings are dignified creatures who should not be treated as specimens or objects of study by the government. I know that there is a profit involved in that adventure. I know that there's convenience involved in that adventure. I'm not willing to venture that path in exchange for my dignity, in exchange for my privacy. Now, there are some very positive movements in Canada that make privacy a priority in tech development. I'm not, unfortunately, aware of the founders of this movement, but the privacy by design movement comes to mind. This is a design movement that places the privacy concerns of individuals at the very heart of tech development. Now, normally when tech's developed with, other targets in mind, right? Boost profitability, make things more convenient, reach new markets. If it's privacy enhancing, oh, that's a great kind of accidental feature of the tech design, but it's just a win along the way. Very often technologies are implemented with absolutely no regard for privacy or other legally protected values. And they won't become privacy preserving until governments come along and make them, or there's a court challenge to the technology or something like that. So there are positive developments in Canada, Kevin. Movers and shakers in the world are deciding that, hey, privacy matters, as we point out in our paper, and that ought to be a primary value in tech design. And I would really like to see the privacy design movement, or the privacy by design movement, start to really influence the conversations around digital ID, because I'm not convinced that governments care about privacy. It certainly matters, but government didn't get the memo.
Okay. This report, now I haven't seen a copy or even a draft, so I don't know if you make recommendations in there. Do you make recommendations?
Good question. I think most of the recommendations came in part one, right? Okay. So we're essentially recommending to government and to policy designers that digital ID is fine, so long as it is what governments are saying it is. It's just a digital counterpart to driver's licenses, passports, healthcare cards, right? Your driver's license doesn't know where you go. It doesn't know what hotels you checked in or at what establishments you purchased an alcoholic beverage, right? The digital ID programs today are much more. They're surveillance programs, they're tracking programs, they're profiling programs. So the recommendations came in part one. Essentially, governments, this is a domain you shouldn't be in, right? Step back. In part two, it's really more of a tool for conversationalists, right? When you're at a party and you say, my privacy matters, almost always you're going to hear back, but why? What's really going on with you, right?
Yeah, if you don't have anything to hide, you don't worry about this. That's always been the counter argument to this kind of
exactly thing. And so there are good counter arguments to that counter argument. I want Canadians to have that. I mean, another thing we didn't talk about was the possibility of intimacy in relationships and friendships.
Right.
You don't just tell anybody personal details about your biography or your body or your desires for the future, right? These are things that we share with intimate partners, with close friends, with our loved ones, right? And so a lot of, even academics will say, look, you don't have intimacy if you don't have privacy. And intimate, come on, who doesn't want to have friends and loved ones? And so, that's what I would say to someone at a party. If someone said, oh, I mean, you're a criminal, you've got something to hide, Luke, I'd say, no, I want my friendships. I want my marriage. I want my security, my autonomy, my human dignity. And I'm not going to exchange some convenience for those, more intangible, but more important values.
Great. That's probably a perfect spot to end this for now. And except to ask you, when can we expect to see this? Is it right around the corner, or is it going to be a week or so? How far off is the release?
Well, I will say the Justice Center. The Justice Center is a very democratic place, and any research that I produce is really, it goes through many different hands, and we all contribute it. We get a legal perspective involved. We have communications involved. We have research involved. So I can't tell you an exact date. I would say stay tuned for about 2 weeks from now.
Beauty. Okay. Looking forward to it, Luke. And thanks so much for being here with us for this discussion and to give us a preview of what's coming up at the Justice Center. Hope to talk to you again real soon.
My pleasure. Thanks so much, Kevin.